Well, first I'd like to thank both Curtis and Gary for pulling this together. It looks like a very interesting conference, oil and gas in the 21st century. And my hope is that with what I provide you with in this talk this evening, provides a context for the rest of the conference. And I hope it provides some challenge for all of you. Would welcome questions. And I hope it opens the way you think about different elements of energy. It's good to be here in Tulsa. Believe it or not, I've done a lot of stuff in energy, but I've never been in Tulsa. Now that's a catastrophe in my mind. It's a great city. I've had a chance to walk around. I know it's an eventful. It's been an eventful time in Oklahoma with the wildfires, and I've been watching that with great interest. In 55,000 acres. Thank God nobody hurt, no fatalities, so that's good so far. Today is a sad day in Oklahoma with the death and the passing of Merle Haggard. For those of you who are like me, a country western fan, I just want to note that is a sad day. You know, Merle was not born in Oklahoma. His parents left Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl, and he moved to, appropriately, Oildale, California, and that's where he was born. So anyway, that's a sad day. And you know, you can't ignore the fact that oil's at $37 a barrel and the impact that that's having on our industry. So a lot of different factors going on in our industry right now that I think I'll try to talk about and touch upon how they will influence this environment of energy that we face. There's a story I want to tell. I really tell this story selfishly, so I have to admit that. There was a boy. I'll call him. He was a energy savant boy, and he was sitting on the front steps of the law library at the University of Tulsa, actually, and an energy analyst, an expert, walked up to him, and the boy was sitting there with a dog, and the man just walked up to him, and he just wanted to make a conversation, and he says, "Son, does your dog bite?" And the boy said, "No." So the energy expert reached out to it was a Labradoodle. He tried to pet it, and the Labradoodle almost took his arm off and chomped on his arm. He said, "Son, I thought you said your dog didn't bite." The boy looked at him and said, "That's not my dog." Now, I tell you that story. This is the selfish aspect of this story. Why would I tell that story? First of all, it pays to ask the right questions. So it pays, especially in energy, it pays to ask the right questions. Second, it pays to listen carefully to the answers. And third, it really pays to really know the dog. So think about that as I'm telling you different stories about different aspects of energy. So the things that I'm going to try to get across to you, and that I hope come across in this talk tonight, is I'll talk a little bit about how we view, the lens with which we view energy and climate and what shapes that. I'll talk a lot about that the world needs energy. You know, energy powers our homes. It provides us transport, lights our houses. It provides all the power that we need for our industry, for our manufacturing, for our hospitals, for our schools. It gets us to work. It's an absolutely critical part of our everyday life. Almost everything that we have, probably everything that we have requires some form of energy. And how many of you have ever lived without any energy through either a crisis or just being in a place that had no access to power for, I'll say, more than a week? Okay, yeah. Now, I mean, it's an event. And it makes you realize that when you don't have energy, you're basically focused for the most part on just survival. and living. So it's absolutely critical. So I'll talk about how the world needs energy. But most of the energy that we provide, unfortunately, produces CO2, and CO2 contributes to climate change. I'll talk a little about that. So how can we provide the energy the world needs and minimize the CO2? And then you say, well, if we've got all the solutions, we have all the renewables, we can do all of this. I'll talk about the pace and the challenge of energy transitions and what it takes to make a major energy transition. That may be a little bit depressing, but shouldn't become depressed. And then I'll finally, because there's ways to address this, and then I'll close just describing different ways through a combination of a pragmatic view of looking at the world, through persistence, through innovation, application of technology and investment, that we can meet the world's energy needs while still addressing our concerns on climate change and CO2. So that'll be kind of the framework with which we look at that. I'll construct this today. So I would go to the presentation. Get my glasses. So our views on energy and climate are colored by many, many different things. And this is from a study done at Yale University and George Mason University. They divided the U.S. into 6 different publics, from alarmed and concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. But all of these things, all of these different groups had different characteristics. They had a different cultural background, different economic backgrounds, different religious backgrounds, different political backgrounds, different levels of education, different views of the world. And all of these things influenced the way they looked at global warming. And not surprisingly, the group ranged from extremely alarmed, the world's coming to an end very quickly, about 12%, to are you absolutely crazy? And this has never happened. It's not even happening at all. Just dismiss it, 11%, and then some groups in between. But these views are not shaped by necessarily science. They're not shaped by great insights into global warming. They're shaped by many different factors, just as my views are, just as your views are, although we don't like to admit that. These are some of the factors that contribute. And just think of this is how they view global warming. It's very interesting to me. So it's scientific, agricultural. Is it a moral issue? Is it a religious issue? You know, the Pope has provided. And how people view global warming varies very differently from the different groups that you have up there. One of the interesting ones, and one which has the most interesting distribution, is both those who are alarmed and dismissive view it as a highly politicized issue. Now, the survey was on global warming. What do you think the survey would look like if the subject was energy poverty? Probably be very similar. Maybe may have some things flipped around. But again, it's a way of saying when you look at these different things, look at all aspects of it. They do shape the way we view the environment around us. The other thing I think that's important to do is to read beyond the headlines. Now, I suspect that most of you, if you're attending this, probably follow the news regarding the energy and global warming and climate change fairly closely. How many of, just out of interest, how many of you follow this fairly closely? Oh, I'm grateful to hear that. So, again, one of the things is, as you go, it really does pay to just not dismiss things that you think you already know. I mean, it's a fantastic headline, isn't it? Almost 1 billion homes to be powered by solar by 2020. That's a remarkable statistic. That would change the world. That was the headline. If you get to the first line in the article, it says about 99 million households worldwide may be powered by solar panels in 2020. Now, that's a big difference. 99 million and a billion. You know, if that was the only, this was one of the most egregious ones, but if that were the only time this comes up, I would say, you know, just dismiss it. But it pays to dig deep. And again, I'd ask you, if as you're looking at different aspects of energy and climate, to read beyond the headlines. This is an extremely polarizing topic. How many of you read Bill McKibben's post in The Nation on the global warming's terrifying new chemistry? Okay, so what was that about? It was about methane, and it was about natural gas and how natural gas is not really contributing in the fight against global warming by reducing CO2, by replacing coal, but that natural gas was actually a much greater contributor because the methane leakage was much greater than people thought that it was. Because methane had increased, and this was all due to fracking. So that was the argument. Now, unfortunately, and again, there was an article that had come out and said methane had increased, and unfortunately, methane is increasing. However, there's also been a number of articles that have come out. This next one by Ted Nordhaus, Bill McKibben's Misleading New Chemistry, that says, yes, methane's been increasing, but it's biogenic in origin, and it's got an agricultural biogenic isotopic signature published in Science. So it's quite a valid, quite a serious piece of work. There's been another one that's come out that says some of it's agricultural, some of it's from industry. There's another study undermines EPA, blames rising methane levels on farming, not fracking. This is all the same topic. Okay, these are just 4 different views. And shale gas-based chemical renaissance dismisses. It's just not discussed. I will tell you, I know a little bit about this, and I believe that Ted Nordhaus's view of this, based on the science, is a valid view. But what I'm trying to show here is it's a very polarized subject. And again, when looking at these things, it pays to dive a little bit deeper into the root causes underlying the headlines. Now, this is one of I love this song. What's the song? The Boxer. So all lies in jest, they sing in Central Park. All lies in jest, still a man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest. And I think in many different things, and particularly in the field of climate and energy, that's what we do. We see what we want to see, and we tend to dismiss and disregard the rest. This leads to all sorts of different ideas about how we can solve the problems that we face in climate and energy. So again, remaining open and not disregarding the rest is important. Seeing things as the way they are is important. Seeing things as the way they are and then having the vision to see things the way that they could be becomes critical. And these are just examples of today. The Tesla Model 3, I don't know what the Tesla Model 3 is going to do when it finally comes out. But it's a vision. It's a pretty important vision. It's changing the way, and I think we'll hear some things from Amy Jaffe in the sessions about electric vehicles, how we're using vehicles. Again, tremendous growth in wind farms. This is in the Marcellus Shale, natural gas, fracking, and its contributions. Again, that was nowhere on the radar screen. Probably the greatest revolution in energy, or one of the greatest revolutions in energy that's come around, certainly in this country. Modular nuclear capabilities. What will happen with those? Will that be a way to provide safer, carbon-free energy? Solar panels, and this bottom one is the largest liquid natural gas transport vessel in the world for a thing called Prelude. all of those things don't just happen. They take enormous persistence, enormous engineering, enormous work with policy, regulatory actions to make them happen. So it takes vision to make these happen, and not dismissing the broader events in industry. This shows a picture taken at night of the world, and you can see that the upper part of the world, northern hemisphere mainly, not only, but really dominates where all the power is. And then you can see the darkness that exists across the equatorial regions of the globe. So almost all the energy in the world today is used in all the areas where all the lights are. Almost all in the area where there are not lights, there are 1.3 billion people who have no access to electricity. And it's climbing, 1.4. I mean, there are 3 billion people who use solid fuels for cooking, dung, charcoal, wood, with tremendous hazards to help. 1 billion people without access to clean water. It's a very significant number of people. And what's most interesting there is the world's population is growing most rapidly where it's darkest. So actually energy use tends to be stable, at least in the Western Hemisphere, where the lights are. So that's where all the energy demand is going to be, and it's going to be a tremendous demand. So who will determine who gets the energy and who doesn't? Who gets to skip? Can you skip the processes of energy evolution that have occurred in the industrialized world to date? And that's going to create, along with this population growth that's occurring, the tremendous demand for energy. And the world needs energy in the years ahead. There are more than 1 million new people, more than the city the size of Tulsa and all its environs, added to the world's population every week. Every week. And those people will need energy. I'm sorry that the top one doesn't show that well, but that just shows the level of absolute extreme poverty in the world through time. And in the early 1800s, over 90% of the people lived in poverty. And today, less than 10% live in extreme poverty, extreme poverty. And you can see, there's a reason that this has happened, and not the only one, but a fundamental driver has been the advent and the use of energy, which has enabled the use of machines, which has enabled the things that we can do in our modern societies that create the jobs that eliminate the poverty and lower the poverty level. This is 1850 to 2010, 814% increase. You see how poverty. So energy is critical for reducing poverty around the world. Another view of the same thing. Without energy, there is extreme poverty. It's income less than $3.10 a day, percentage of people on the x-axis, and what the electrification rate is on the right. And basically, you can see if the electrification rate is very low, people live in extreme poverty. And most of those people live in equatorial Africa. And again, you've probably all seen this statistic that the average refrigerator in the U.S. uses 9 times the electricity that the average person in Ethiopia has access to. I mean, it's a tremendous challenge. This is the area where energy use will grow. So the world needs energy. Now, where does that energy come from? So this is the way it is today. And I say that sometimes this is a surprise to people, probably not to most of you. But more than 85% of the energy today is provided by fossil fuels. So about 29% coal, 31% oil, 21% natural gas, a chunk for hydro. And nuclear, about 6%. That orange line, the thin one, is renewables today. It's around 2%. And renewables are growing it's a small scale. But all of this energy that the world is using, most of it, more than 85%, produces CO2. And that's the challenge. Here's the U.S. picture. I won't go into detail. What's interesting is renewable energy, and nuclear is about 8%. Renewable energy in total is about 10%. But then you see, again, this is 2014. Of that, 4% of the 10%, 4% of the 10% is solar. 18% of the 10% is wind. So wind and solar in total are less than 3%. Now, how many, is that your perception of wind and solar? By the way, wind's growing very rapidly in Oklahoma and Texas. So what's ahead? So population will continue to grow. And again, it has continued, it will continue. It's growing at about 1 billion people or more. It's actually closer, more, per week. 1 million people per week. And it grows to almost 9 billion people by 2050. So tremendous increase in energy demand. This is happening, and energy use along with that will continue to grow because people want and need energy. And this is happening despite the best of our efficiencies. Sure, this decoupling between GDP and energy use is happening, but it's still definitely linked. And GDP will continue to grow. Almost all of the growth in energy use sits outside of the OECD countries. What are the OECD countries? They're basically not Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And they're not equatorial Africa. It's Western Europe is the OECD's, and the US, Australia, etc. So here it shows a different use. The most interesting thing about this chart, now, I recognize that this is all BP data. Dismiss. I can show you umpteen scenarios. Energy use grows by different amounts, 20%, 40%, doubles. The most interesting thing on this plot is all energy use continues to grow through this time period because the world needs energy. The greatest growth is in those dark areas of the map, and is in India, is in China. One of the things to read when you read about energy use, you'll often see, there's this tremendous growth in percentage. Always remember the mathematics of the tremendous in growth in percentage, starting with a small number and growing. It's important. But also remember, if that percentage base is changing off of a bigger and bigger pie, in absolute amounts, the energy use is still increasing. So despite oil losing a share through time in various scenarios, despite coal losing share, actually energy annual growth in oil and gas continues to increase in absolute terms, even though the percentage share goes down. Of course, renewables goes up significantly, importantly, but the others continue to grow, and this is important, especially when we think about the impact on climate, CO2. This is not the only scenario. Here's another scenario. This is what it would take to get to a world in which you only had a 2-degree centigrade rise in temperature. And basically what it says is you've got to cut your CO2 in half, and you end up now not having 60 or 70% fossil fuels in 2050, but you have somewhere less than 50% and more. And if you put nuclear with renewables, it accounts for more than 50% of energy. But, you can look at the top line and the bottom is China. China, and you got to think a lot about China. China will still be 50% fossil fuels at that point in day. And this is a It's a pretty optimistic scenario. It's one that you can hope that can happen. Here's another one. This, because I wanted to show all realms. This is one that says, okay, we can do this. We're going to eliminate fossil fuels altogether. By the way, we're going to also eliminate nuclear. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to have a much increased efficiencies. We're going to conserve more. We're going to use less energy because of electrification and the efficiency of electric motors. That's on the top. So that takes away a big chunk of energy use. And then we're going to have a tremendous expansion in solar and wind and hydro power. Now this challenge, I have to admire this model, because this model says if you remove all constraints in all economics, this is what can happen. And if you can just instantly implement, for example, a wind farm in offshore East Coast, for example, this is what you can do. It is the only model of that. It's the 100% renewable energy model. I just put it out there and I want to just discuss, it's not going to be this. But it will be some combination between this and the first BP model that I showed. Maybe it'll be something like that 2DS model. So energy, I was in New Orleans 2 days ago, and I took this photo off of my hotel room wall, a painting. And I took this one flying into New Orleans. So energy is like a big ship on a big river. It's got to navigate all sorts of things. Strong currents flowing with it, flowing against it, cross currents. You have lots of turns ahead. It takes a long time to turn a big ship. You actually have to turn before you're in the turn if you want to make a shift. So energy and our energy mix is a lot like one of these big shifts. And we see here the shift actually from steam power to diesel also as part of this. So I thought that was interesting. This is energy transitions in reality. This is the history of energy transitions. And if you look at this, what it shows is that it takes a long time for one source of energy or multiple sources of energy to take the place of the other sources of energy. So it took coal 70 years to achieve 20% of the total primary, TPES, total primary energy supply. 70 years. Oil, 65 years. Natural gas, 85 years. Nuclear has not achieved 20%. For all, that's 5% in 30 years. It takes a long time. Renewables are the violet-colored swath on the top of the chart. Even in places where you hear about for example, the success, the French with nuclear power. France achieved 40% nuclear power, but it took 30 years. That is a great success, a tremendous success. So today, we're fortunate. We see tremendous growth in new forms of low-carbon energy. This shows the growth in wind has grown 83%. It's 423 gigawatts. Solar rises to 50 gigawatts in 2015. How much power is used in the world? This is capacity. How much power is used in the world each year? 23,000 plus terawatts. I just want to put, this is tremendous growth. This is good. It takes a lot of power to power the world. This shows some of that growth. Now, this was from 2014, 740,000 electric vehicles. Look at that. That growth is tremendous. Actually, the number now in 2015 sold more than 400,000 in 2015. It's now over over 1 million electric vehicles. In Norway, the market share is up to 12%. most other places. Okay, so we now have sold total cumulative a million. How many vehicles are sold a year? Around 82 million are sold a year. What's the average lifespan of a vehicle? Somewhere 11, 12, some people say 15, depends where you are in the world. So they have a pretty long residence time. 1.2 billion vehicles driving around in the world today. So this is important. This is good. This is a rapid growth. It takes time. 1 million, 1.2 billion residence vehicles today. And this is what solar. This shows the growth, world consumption, solar energy. The cumulative annual growth rate for solar here is impressive, 66%. Extremely impressive. But it's only a small fraction of what we see in the world. And it will continue to grow. It will continue to grow. At what pace? It needs to be supported to be able to continue to grow. Some of the challenges. If you project forward, right now there is almost 200,000, say 170,000 megawatts of solar photovoltaics installed. Could be up to over 600,000 by 2025. In the same time period, there's 1.2 megawatts of coal proposed, mainly in China. So this is great for power and new sources of power and clean power. This will overwhelm this. What's the average lifespan of a coal-fired power plant? 40 years. Takes a long time to make energy transitions. This just shows all the news about the retirements of coal-fired power plants in the U.S. They are shown in the dark blue. You can see still operating a lot. Average lifespan 40 years. Some big newer coal plants in there. Coal will be providing energy for decades. So not to get discouraged, there needs to be solutions for coal-fired power. It's not like you just give up. How many have heard, I never pronounce it right, Energiewende in Germany? It's a big deal. So this is the translation of the German economy to cleaner energy, a more renewable energy, tremendous growth in wind. But the Germans, at the same time, following Fukushima, removed nuclear. So you see nuclear was reduced. What was the net impact of that? All the non-renewables, it's just flat. So despite all the best efforts in Germany, and then they replaced it with wind, and then they needed a base load of electricity for the times that it was not being supplied, so they needed natural gas. The output of that is that pretty much the output of fossil fuels has remained very close to what it was despite these best efforts. So is that a success? Does that solve the problem, the challenge? Nuclear energy, another one. Nuclear's declined from 17.5 to 11% of total electricity. Many, many shutdowns. The nuclear plant, I grew up near a nuclear power plant, shut down now. Zero carbon electricity, this will surprise you, has declined from 37% to 31%, despite all the efforts that have been made, solar and renewables. Despite that, it's declined. This is a hard fact, but it's not a fact. Nuclear energy is an essential component of a low-carbon world because it takes a tremendous amount of renewable energy source to replace one nuclear power plant. Cost matters. I think there's been tremendous progress in the cost of energy around the world. This just shows everything from natural gas, combined cycle, wind, geothermal, biomass, hydro, nuclear. And you can see that actually in this, wind is getting close to natural gas. And in some places in the U.S. onshore, it's very cost competitive, especially if it's supported with subsidies. You see that nuclear can be a little more expensive, solar more expensive. Cost matters to people in what they buy. Here's an example. If you had a price on carbon, things start to equilibrate, because if you included the price on carbon, they start to become closer. This includes a $30 a ton price on carbon. So you see the differences between solar, which has also improved significantly through time, but onshore wind, natural gas, coal starting to equilibrate. And if you put the price on carbon, then nuclear becomes about the same also. Price matters. The lower the oil price, the greater the price challenge for electric vehicles. Now, Tesla and others have announced tremendous progress with storage and battery powers, now down to about $300 a megawatt. So, I mean, this is important. So, excuse me, $300 a kilowatt hour. This is important. But what you can see is that today, at this price here with a Tesla, go to about $300, which is around where it is today. The break-even price for oil, just if pure economics on that, is around $400 a barrel. Now that's an enormous thing, and I really will be interested. The battery price is right. The price of oil you can but it's a very, very high price. Today, the oil price was, what did I say? $37, which is what it is. The battery price would need to be less than $50 per kilowatt. So we have a long way to go. This influences the way people buy. It still does. I had one person say, no, it doesn't. I said, okay. But it does. And it does if you look at things in aggregate. If you're affluent, you can always buy a Tesla. But the price needs to drop for this to be available to people everywhere. And this is what happens as oil prices have dropped. We see average sales weighted mile per gallon going up. So actually that's been good. It starts to drop, and now it flattens out. So there was an 11% decrease in the sales of Priuses last year. SUV sales went up 11%. So price matters to people. Here's another plot that shows that U.S. gasoline demand that increased. The recession hit, it started going down. It's now increasing and increasing. Gasoline demand is not falling, it is increasing. It's not only in the U.S. Here shows gasoline consumption in India. The same story is true in China. Price matters. Policy matters. Production tax credits, renewable energy credits matter. They create a very favorable environment, economic environment for investments in renewables. That's essential, actually, to keep a pace of renewable energy growing in this country. All this chart shows is that when the production tax was about to expire, things were starting to go down as people feared that it would not be extended. When it was put in place again, the investments have gone up. So this is a model here that shows what the utility scale wind and solar will be on the clean power plant only, and then what it will be with the extension of the credits and the production tax. Another version of that will show a similar thing. I just wanted to put this slide in to say that Oklahoma is a leader in wind energy, and as is Texas, and Texas is a leader in natural gas. Much of the additions of energy have been in wind capacity. Wind is up 47% in the U.S. Of all the stuff that was installed last year. 47% of everything. It's a tremendous thing. It takes a long time, though, to make the transition, because all those coal-fired power plants are still there. So there's the reminder. You know, that's the reminder. So what do? You've got a world that's warming, CO2 climbing, it's well over 400 parts per million right now. You have cities around the world. I did a little survey, I won't bore you with, of cars in the parking lots today and the kind of car. Cities of the world using energy, and global poverty still existing, and energy poverty existing. How do you balance these? What decisions are required? How do you start to look at that world? I thought, what would Winston do? You know, these are not simple problems. It's an extremely complex problem. It shouldn't be polarized. It requires systems to be able to solve this and work on this. So, world needs more energy. World needs less CO2. Energy transformation takes decades. Price and policy matter. It's not a small challenge. This shows the magnitude of CO2 reductions required to be able to get to the 2-degree scenario. These are gigatons of CO2 here on the x-axis. For power, 300 gigatons. You can see the others, industry and so forth. Just for reference, the global CO2 emissions themselves in 2014 were 32 gigatons. It's a tremendous challenge. So, what are the characteristics of an energy system that would go beyond what we'll call the fabulist? You know, just make it up. You know, that has a basis in the infrastructure that we have, the investments that are needed, the residence time of these, economics, price. What are the basis of that? People need to be able to afford it. It needs to be accessible to people. It needs to be safe. It needs to be scalable, and that's an essential thing. It needs to be able, you need to be able to build massive scale. It needs to be secure, can't be used against you. Sustainable, low CO2, small footprint, and reliable, or you need a solution if it's intermittent. So you need that backup. Those are some characteristics that you might use. Now, I looked at this chart today. This is how different solutions fit that. Now, first of all, this chart is not right. There is no, this is a viewpoint of this chart. Second of all, as I viewed it, especially on the screen, it looks very optimistic. But yellow can be tough. But what it says is that there's some fuels, natural gas, oil, and coal, that are accessible, affordable. They're very scalable. They don't have an intermittency problem. And there are others, wind, solar, and hydro, that are great on CO2 and its impact. They're very good from a security standpoint. They decrease our reliance on energy. They're difficult to turn into weapons against us. There's nuclear, which can be scalable, doesn't have intermittency things, and is clean. But there is no perfect. None of these things are perfect. And each one of you have your favorites. I have my favorites. None of them are perfect. So when there is no perfect, you try to choose the good. So what might that be? So these are the characteristics here. Could be a policy that advocates the use of natural gas and nuclear instead of having many barriers in place to keep those from being implemented. We still need to incentivize, if you want to have rapid growth, CCSU is carbon capture, storage, and usage. Because why? There's a lot of stuff that continues to emit CO2. You need to capture the carbon from that. Nuclear, wind, solar, efficiency. Projects that lower actual CO2, they need to be incentivized. The energy research budget across this country and others should be enhanced to jumpstart energy research. Capital access is a major problem in all those dark areas of the map. It's It's a major problem. It's got a lot of things with funding, economics, corruption, and a phased carbon fee that can level the playing field, puts this hodgepodge of different policies together, provide a framework in which industry can expect things to work and develop technologies that will work in a low-carbon environment. Natural gas. Natural gas has probably made one of the greatest contributions to providing both new energy and lowering CO2 emissions, certainly this century, but for the previous century also. Look at that advent of natural gas combined cycle power plants in the early part of this century. Natural gas consumption went up. What happened? Natural gas replaced CO2, not so much for environmental reasons, for economic reasons in many cases. And overall, CO2 from fossil fuels went down. That's a tremendous, has a major scalable impact on CO2. This is one of the scenarios that shows, again, even in a low carbon scenario, that natural gas continues to increase in use, mainly through replacing coal, up until 2030 at least. I've mentioned the importance of incentives to be provided. It makes a big difference how rapidly you can pace, especially solar, wind, batteries. Could be applied to nuclear. It's the opposite of what's applied to nuclear. This shows the difference in what you can do. This is a model, of course, all these things are models, but with the incentives of the Clean Power Plan only, and then with the extension of tax credits. Nuclear. How many of you read about Diablo Canyon in California? Diablo Canyon, one of the major power suppliers in California right now, due to be shut in as we move into the next decade. That facility produces twice as much electricity as all California's solar panels right now. So you have to, it's about choices. Do you keep that open? Do you keep that running in a way that's stable and safe? Those are the choices. The IEA says in order for the world to meet the global warming limit proposed in Paris, nuclear share of global energy production will need to grow from 11% to around 16% by 2030. So there's a whole separate discussion, whole separate talk about security, about health risks, about danger, terrorism, nuclear threats, etc. Those are some of the choices that need to be made and that can be managed. Research. This is what the research department, the Department of Energy. So what's most interesting to me about this is that it's about $6 billion a year for all elements of research. Now, the oil majors combined spend about $6 billion a year. The government could probably fund more than $6 billion a year of fundamental research, and it would make a significant difference. 3 times as much, 5 times as much. And I think that research that will be funded will lead to significant developments both in technology and our ability to implement. Carbon capture and storage, that's essential. Without carbon capture and storage, you will not meet the 2-degree target. But it's remarkable how little attention, this gets paid attention to, but it gets largely ignored. It's a minimal part of the agreement in Paris. It's an essential component. Why? Right now it costs too much. But another factor is that if you do this politically, it keeps fossil fuels going. So it doesn't get a lot of support, but it's an essential ingredient of meeting a 2-degree target. I've mentioned the research, what it can do. That's lowering silicon. It's still $300 a megawatt. Investment dollars have grown tremendously. This is probably one of the most important things. But it's not so much the investment dollars in the U.S., it's in developing nations. And how can you transfer investment dollars into these developing nations? And a carbon price. A tranched, rising carbon price that begins at low levels and then rises to some sustainable level that can be revenue neutral, for which companies and people and individuals are given credit for investing in more efficient energy sources, can be a very effective tool to balance that playing field and to assure that we have a continued development of new energy forms at a pace that can be brought together. And the oil and gas industry faces a hodgepodge of policy, regulations, regardless, trying to kind of do what this would do in a very simple mechanism. So that stability may actually be favorable, although many people would challenge that. What's the industry done through this time? Oil and gas industry. Shift to gas. All the majors have shifted to gas. A focus on value over volumes, lower unit cost basins, energy efficiency, technical innovation. Energy, the majors have a shadow price for carbon. They use it already. It's embedded in the projects. It's used in the project economic decisions. Shell, where Curtis and I worked, the price was $40 a ton. Already in there. Many use this in their assessment of projects. And complementary skills and capabilities. You know, project management, risk analysis, financing of major projects, operational efficiency. These are things that can translate to different parts of the industry. You see it in different places. There's a wind farm here, happens to be one of Shell's. Carbon capture and storage is part of another project associated with industry. Active investment in things that will lower the CO2 output from the industry. So, who wants to change? Who wants to change? This is true. You know, very few people want to take that initiative themselves to be able to change. Because of time, I won't talk, but I've got a thing I imposed my own carbon tax on me. Called it a carbon tax on me. The average American puts out about 17 tons of CO2 a year. So I imposed my carbon tax on me. I made my carbon tax on me $40 a ton. It changed my behaviors. And then I use that money, and I take that money and I invest it in new ideas in energy efficiency, in energy poverty. And anybody wants to know where to invest in energy poverty, happy to talk with you. But there are things that you can do, that you can do as individuals. But of course, that's a small scale. And to meet the challenges that we have around the world, it's really going to take many, many different things. Now, I took this photo in the Houston Marathon about 4 years ago, and I'll never forget it. It was about 34 degrees out. It was sleeting. There's about a 40-mile-an-hour wind. There was nobody out there. And this guy kind of came by me in this sleet, and I mean, there is direction and determination and persistence in that man and what he did in that marathon. It just had a major impact on me. And I thought that's what is needed as we look at energy. So you need to have a practical outlook on energy, a pragmatic outlook at energy. And you need to be persistent because it takes time. It takes decades in some case. But it needs to be, it's a strange combination. You need to combine that pragmatism and that persistence with innovation, technology, and then the willingness to take risks and invest to make those changes. And those are the things I think that will ultimately contribute to not only providing the energy that the world is going to continue to need, and I hope I demonstrated that, if nothing else today. The world will continue to need energy, but will also contribute to showing how we can use lower carbon sources to help meet that energy need. So I'll close with that and welcome any questions.